called the Alliance for Democracy, and we have been connected for about 12 years. I think when Papa Bush was president, we started, and then we carried on to just kind of get people into conversations about the major issues and things that we were facing in the country. So we're very excited to welcome all of you, and also welcome Chuck Collins, who this is his second time being with us. He presented in January 2009, and the topic at the time was economic meltdown, how it happened, how we got into it, and what we possibly could do to get out of it. And it took place right here, and people were so moved by his presentation, they would stop me in the supermarket and say, well, I hope you'd invite him back again sometime, because people would say, I didn't fully understand the economics of how this crisis took place. And the way he explained it, people really did understand it. But before we actually welcome Chuck, I'm going to just take a minute to introduce a few people that are here tonight who represent a couple of different groups. And first of all, Tom Holbrook is here from a River Run bookstore, and he has some of Chuck's books, if you're interested. One of his books, 99 to 1, this book that Chuck Collins wrote. So I just want to tell you, Tom Holbrook is over there. And local Democratic Chair, Larry Drake, is here. And Larry, is there anything you want to say?
Okay. I encourage people to attend the New Hampshire Rebellion Walk on July 5th.
And actually, that was the next thing I was going to mention, that we're going to have a representative from the New Hampshire Rebellion, but Jeff and Mark, the two gentlemen who are going to be here, are actually with Professor Lessig in Boston right now. And there's a march taking place July 5th, and already 6,000 people have walked across parts of New Hampshire, kind of following in Granny D's footsteps. And this is what would you say, it's Hampton Beach to Fort Constitution, and it's how to raise the issue of getting corruption and big money out of politics and out of Washington, D.C. So that's New Hampshire Rebellion. There's flyers you would pick up. And is there anyone here from Portsmouth now? Okay, it's an organization that formed in Portsmouth, a group of people who are concerned about development and overdevelopment in Portsmouth. Occupy, and maybe Mike Hasty, you could speak to that just for a second and tell us a little bit, like 1 minute on TPP.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is still somewhat a viable issue. It's a very scary trade trade agreement that is being negotiated among 12 Pacific Rim nations, including the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Japan, and others. I have a number of, the Alliance for Democracy is organizing town resolutions against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we're trying to do in our town of South Berwick, Maine. There are some issues of Justice Rising, which is the Alliance for Democracy newsletter from last fall, is about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's got a lot of good articles about it. If you're interested in that, and they're sitting up there on the table, so help yourself.
Our wonderful speaker, guest speaker today, and the topic is wealth inequality, how it undermines our economy, our democracy, and our health, and what we can do about it, if we can do anything about it. He's a senior scholar at the Institute of Policy Studies and founder of United for a Fair Economy, and has written a number of books. He's a national expert on economic inequality and the economic crisis that we've gone through, that we're still experiencing. And based on the Institute for Policy Studies, he's the director of the Program for Inequality and the Common Good, and chairs a group called the Working Group on Extreme Inequality. So, without saying anything else, welcome Chuck Collins. Thank you.
I want to particularly thank Nancy and Bill Pagnon, who really have stayed in touch with me over the years and kept me posted, and Bill has an awesome email list of kind of data. If you're like a data geek, you should talk to Bill, because he is too. Anyway, and I also want to thank my partner Mary Wallace for coming up here to Portsmouth from Boston for a date night. Not all spouses. We had a really nice slice of pizza at Joe's All-American, you know, about 10 minutes to have dinner, you know, so it's a really great night out of time, so coming in. And the topic tonight reminds me of the question that was asked to the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty. You know, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. We went out to Los Angeles. It was very exciting. It turned out that the day we were there, the museum was closed, so we didn't get to go. But J. Paul Getty was once asked, how does one become wealthy in America? And he said, it's really easy. There's 3 things you have to do. And I'll do a little poll here. First, get up early every morning. How many of you got up early?
Early for me.
Early for you, good. 2, work hard all day. 3, find oil. Okay. So none of you quite made the cut. So, as Nancy said, I wrote a book with the kind of alarming title of 99 to 1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World. And people sort of have I realize now, if I could do it over again, I wouldn't name it that, because I think it's sort of, maybe, it's a polarizing frame. It doesn't sort of invite people into a conversation. And I should say right up front that I was born in the 1%. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer. Some of you may have heard of him. And my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon has a different meaning in our family. See, there's a lot of inside jokes about being fed bologna and things like that. And so I grew up in a wealthy, affluent family in suburban Detroit. I was surrounded by, I actually thought I was middle class because Bill Taubman came to school in a chauffeur-driven car, and Kathy Iacocca's dad was the head of the car company, and she walked to school. And so I sort of was like, compared to them, you know, my dad took us to school in his own Mercedes-Benz, you know, like we were not, so it takes a little while sometimes growing up to figure out where you fit in. So I went to Cranbrook School, which is a private school outside Detroit, and one of my older classmates was a guy named Mitt Romney. And we lived literally across from the golf course from each other and sledded on the same hill. He did have a nicer sled than I do, I remember that, but I don't have any resentment about that. And our school motto was aim high, which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight into the air. And if you go to the Cranbrook School website, you'll see this image, which, if you think about it, is an incredibly reckless thing to do. I mean, I do archery, and if any of my children should ever aim an arrow straight into the air, they would be in big trouble. You know? But anyway, so I say that in part because when I talk about the 1% or the wealthy, these are actually people I know really well. They're family members, many of whom I think are as concerned about these issues as you or I am, and would be on the kind of, you want them on your team to fix something, and so these are people I grew up with. So what I want to talk though about is how these trends of inequality are affecting the quality of our lives. And I think that I kind of make this assumption that most people now are getting kind of saturated in the data of the picture, but that we're a little bit, we don't really have enough sense of the possible solutions or interventions. So I really want to spend most of our time together thinking about that with you. But a couple things have happened in the last couple of years. There was the Occupy movement, which sort of brought to the fore these issues of inequality. Kind of, they were there, but they sort of were raised up, and the sort of whole meme of 99 to 1. There's a new film out that came out in September called Inequality for All, starring Robert Wright. I'm curious if any of you have had a chance to see that film.
Twice.
Okay, you get extra credit. It is probably a good idea to watch it twice because it's a really terrific documentary, and of course it had a commercial release and was probably in your movie theater for about 5 minutes. So don't feel bad that you didn't get there in the 5 minutes it was there. But you can now watch it, you know, stream it, watch it at home, that kind of thing. Inequality for All. And there's a terrific, on the website for that film, there's a great little action portal that I helped design that has a variety of sort of things. So that's a place to go to find out more ways to be involved. The other thing, the phenomena, is this new book by the French economist Thomas Piketty. Anybody seen that? Capital. I don't know if you have any copies of that River Run.
Can't keep it in.
Can't keep it in. Yeah, there you go. So, go figure. A 690-page book by a French economist is now up there with Danielle Steele's First Kiss, on the bestseller list. It's a rare cultural event that, that a book about wealth inequality by a French economist is sold out on Amazon, and they have to go out and reprint it. But it's a fascinating phenomenon. It's a fascinating book. I like to tell my friends that I read it in the original French, but they know that I couldn't tell a stop sign in French, so they probably doesn't know. But it's actually a remarkable read. I have read most of it, and it sort of tells the sweeping story. And Thomas Piketty and a guy named Saiz from Berkeley, University of California, together have really done the historic data in the U.S. and globally on these trends. And so we'll talk, people want to talk more about his, I'll sort of weave in a little bit of some of his insights. But one thing, I put a sheet over here with a couple of suggested links, and short of reading the book, there's a terrific interview with the economist Paul Krugman about the work of Thomas Piketty, and then there's a talk by him that you can hear him talking about his ideas at the City University of New York. So short of going to hear him yourself, you can watch him on those videos. So let me give you a couple of headlines up front. And I'm not going to actually, I didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to show you charts of concentrations of wealth and that sort of thing. I think that my assumption is most people now are got the picture. But let me just say a couple of upfront headlines. One is, we're living in a period of extreme wealth inequality that is really unparalleled since the first Gilded Age a century ago. Meaning that this is the first time that the concentration of wealth in the hands of really, say, the 1% and really the top 10th of 1% is at a sort of dizzying level. And that is a story, that trend kind of has ripples through our lives. It has ripples through your lives, it has ripples in the community that we can talk about. The second thing, and this is really Thomas Piketty's main point, is left unchecked, these inequalities are going to take us somewhere where we don't want to go. It will take us toward a society not ruled by entrepreneurial wealth, but by inherited wealth, by the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the Gateses and the Buffetts and the Kochs and the Waltons, that we're essentially seeing huge wealth dynasties emerging that will be fundamentally at odds with our democratic heritage. The third point that I would just make is these inequalities really matter deeply to the quality of our lives. And I'll try to unpack some of those. The other point I'd like to make is, if you put the economic inequality picture together with our ecological crisis, with the fact that we're facing dramatic climate change, it's upon us, it is here, we're going to experience it in the forms of weird weather and drought like in the West, and strange storms and growing precipitation here in New England, and longer heat waves, and there's going to be a number of disruptions that are a function of the climate. Put that together with these extreme inequalities, and you have a kind of potential toxic brew, which is that the quality of life for all but a very, very few number of people is going to start to deteriorate further from ecological and economic disruption. And I would argue that those trends are actually bad for everybody. That even people who think that they're buffered from them or are in the very top of the 1%, I would say to them, as someone who came from the 1%, actually this is not in your self-interest at all. We are all going, the quality of life, the wealth, what you consider to be your wealth will be undermined by these economic and ecological changes. I think the other thing I want to say is, it doesn't have to be this way. There are ways to intervene in this these cycles of inequality that can reverse them. And just a short history point, which is there was this Gilded Age 100 years ago. There were a variety of reasons, but a combination of organizing on different constituencies, public policies, the institution of income and wealth taxation in 1916, programs linked to the Great Depression, and coming out of World War II, we had an entirely different period. We had a period of essentially 30 years of shared prosperity. And that was because humans were engaged in working to make a society where prosperity was more broadly shared. So we've actually faced extreme inequality as a nation before and responded in a way. So we can fix this, and I have the privilege in a sense of seeing a lot of things going on that give me some encouragement, and I'll report on that to you. A couple of facts that I just find helpful to just sort of frame things. Really, wages, earnings for 65 to 70% of the population have pretty much remained flat since the mid-1970s. So real wages have not gone up for the vast majority of people. How have people survived? They've taken on more hours in the workplace, they've more income earners per household, and they've gone deeper into debt to maintain a standard of living. That's, in some ways, those actions have masked the fundamental reality that real wages are flat. Meanwhile, the share of national income going to this top 1% has continued to grow since the mid-70s. So in 1976, the richest 1%, the highest income 1%, received 9% of all national income. Last year it was closer to 21%. That's a big change in a short time. The richest 1% in terms of wealth has 36% of all the private wealth, about 43% of all financial wealth, taking out housing. So that top 1% has almost approaching half of all financial wealth. But as I alluded, the dizzying growth in wealth inequality is really in not just the 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%, and even within that, the very, very tippy top. So we now have a situation where the Forbes 400, the wealthiest 400 individuals, have almost combined $2.1 trillion in wealth. To give you a sense of what that means, that is the equivalent to the entire African American population, 41 million households in the United States. 400 wealthy individuals have as much wealth as the entire African American population of 41 million people. That's how imbalanced it is at the top. Of the 100 largest profitable corporations in the United States, 26 of them last year paid their CEOs more than they paid in taxes to the US Treasury. Paid their top managers more. CEOs now in the top 1,000 companies make more in a day than most of their employees make in a year. The gap used to be, the ratio was 42 to 1 when I started tracking it in 1980. Today it is between 300 to 400 to 1 in different years. It's about 350 to 1. So that's probably enough, right, to give you the picture. I'm happy to, Tom is selling a book over here that kind of continues, you know, if you need more data, if you need more of the picture, it's there. But one thing I would just say is these changes have happened in a very short time, in pretty much all of our lifetime, in all of our memory. Really since the late 70s, there's been, these trends have emerged. And it's a departure from the economy of the 30 years after World War II, dramatically. Now some people, I have done a lot of talk radio, I've done a lot of talks about these issues. People get anxious about this topic. They hear a fomentation of class war. They worry that I'm going to talk about redistribution of wealth, which I am going to talk about, right up front about it, because we are living through a period of redistribution of wealth, a dramatic upward redistribution of wealth from middle-income households largely to the top. And even within the top 10%, from the top 10% to the top 1/10 of 1%. It's really stunning. Let me just briefly make the case of why this matters. It may be obvious, but In the like 25 years I've been sort of tracking these issues, it's fair to say right now that you could have a interdisciplinary department of inequality studies with earth scientists and sociologists and health epidemiologists and people from all these different disciplines that would look at this question of how these inequalities is affecting the quality of our lives. And if you take a moment just to pause and think, what is it that you deeply care about? Probably care about your family, children, grandchildren, quality of your neighborhood, the health of the ecosystem around you, care about the quality of the community spaces, the public spaces, your health, your own personal health and the well-being and health of your neighbors, culture, sports. In every one of these areas, the extreme inequalities of wealth have undermined and wrecked what it is we care most deeply about. If you care about democracy, that's obvious. The concentration of wealth is a concentration of power. It's disenfranchising us. It's essentially taking our vote away from us. If somebody has to run for national office now, they need to have a billionaire at their side, or preferably a couple billionaire patrons to finance their campaigns. That was a big debate in the Republican primaries last time, was who is Sheldon Adelson, the casino mogul, going to support? Because if Sheldon supports you, you are a viable candidate. And if he doesn't support you, you're not a viable candidate. How could this be? So we know it affects the health of our democracy. It affects the health of our economy. Too much inequality leads to economic instability. You have wealthy people with huge amounts of money speculating in the economy, destabilizing the economy through financial speculation. You have a growing number of working people who are surviving based on borrowing and working more hours. That's not a healthy contribution. That leads to volatility and ups and downs. And as we talked about here 4 years ago, the economic meltdown, one of the underlying causes was these extreme inequalities and how that fueled the instability in the economy. If you care about social mobility, the idea that what you do matters and works, whether somebody works hard and they have the opportunity to move up an economic ladder, research is now showing that these extreme inequalities of wealth are undermining social mobility for a number of reasons. But one reason is affluent families, say in the top 10%, are able to provide their children enormous advantages all along the way, in terms of from birth until school readiness, into college preparation, till work preparation, and have kind of those children have launched onto a totally different trajectory. Meanwhile, we've disinvested the kinds of investments in early education and other things that create a level playing field. So if you are not born wealthy and you want to have the American dream of working hard and having a good life, I advise moving to Canada, because today Canada is making this kinds of upfront investments in early childhood education and health and tutoring and intervention around mental health and debt-free college education and access to a whole variety of public investments that create opportunity. And we're doing the opposite. So what we're seeing is accelerating advantages for kids at the top and compounding disadvantages for everyone else. That's a function of these inequalities. I could go down the list. Sports. The sport, which is a fundamental human activity, has been taken over by professional sports that are become essentially big businesses. And God bless any of you who are coaches and doing amateur sport at the local level, because that's the essence of sport. But larger sense of sport has been completely trashed. Don't get me going on that one. If you care about capitalism, if you care about the healthy functioning of a private marketplace, you should be very concerned about the distortions created by these extreme inequalities of wealth. Health. Now there's an enormous amount of research showing that you're better off living in a society with lower income but relatively lower inequality than living in a society with extreme inequality. Too much inequality is bad for your health. And the fundamental reason for that is that when we pull apart too wide, there's a breakdown in solidarity. The people don't feel that they're in the same boat. They don't feel like we're in that your children and my children are, that I care about those children over there. People create distances and mythologies about each other and pull apart, and that undermines public health and the investments we need to have to make healthy societies. So on and on. Those are some of the things, and I kind of list in a kind of pithy way some of the research on that. In fact, I was introduced recently about this book with the rousing endorsement that this is an incredibly thin book. Features. I mean, look, think about it. Which one are you really going to read? I'm not trying to be a huckster here, I'm just trying to be fun. But what can we do about it? And I thought maybe what I might do is just ask you, though, before I get into that, to just take a minute, if you came with a friend or somebody, buddy up with them, if you came alone, introduced yourself to a neighbor, just thinking for a couple minutes, reflect on what do these inequalities mean for you personally? Like, how does this touch you? And when you think about a solution, what comes to mind, if anything? So I'm just thinking for a couple minutes, just anybody talk amongst yourself. And if you don't have somebody to talk to, just put your hand up and find somebody else. Don't sit by yourself. Talk to somebody. I wasn't thinking long speeches, but sort of like almost popcorn. What did this mean? What do these trends mean for you personally? I'm curious if there are anything you want to share.
Stressful. Very stressful, and that creates health problems at the beginning.
That's right. It's stressful. And that is part of how living in an extremely unequal society where you sort of have a sense of precariousness leads to certain stress and stress-related illnesses. That's one of the things that status anxiety around economic survival is a source of huge stress.
Yeah, part of that stress is the kids coming into the culture now, their choice is like hunting games. They go to war, get money, go to school, or they take out enormous amounts of debt. They can't be discharged once they leave school. A lot of times they can't find jobs in their field anyway.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible thing to happen to the kids.
Yeah, how these trends cut generationally are a really big difference. If you're under 30 and entering into this economy, it's a very different experience, and it's something we should be aware of as parents or just allies of young people, that they're looking at a very different economy than if you entered the workforce in the 70s or 80s. Yeah. Other meanings, yeah.
Working from the young people, how have we, the older generation, allowed ourselves to start believing that the only worth is monetary? We've lost our sense of pride and accomplishment. Are the millennials getting it back? They may be.
Yeah.
The absence of a real taxation, a policy of taxation. Not, Piketty is 80%, but whatever.
Yeah.
When I was young, the people with a lot of money, with a lot of great income and wealth, paid taxes. They supported the country. They made money, and it would high taxes would act as a disincentive for people craving, lusting for millions. It would be a disincentive as well as providing a lot of wealth nationally for everybody.
Yes,
I
sir.
wonder if the people in here would support a major change toward in the direction of progressive taxation. As Piketty is saying, 80%, maybe 70%, and it tapers down as you have less income. I wonder how many in here might not support a progressive tax, because it just might hit somewhere in the middle class take away some of our money. We
Okay.
have to see how that's spelled out.
Most of your taxation is local, so that starts at City Hall. With your property taxes, I mean, a lot of towns are over-assessing your house of what your property is worth to get revenue at a price that you can never sell that property for.
Because the federal government is not taxing people with money. That's why. Because it falls on local authorities. That's why.
Let's just hear if any others have both the sort of something that's meant to them or a policy idea. Yeah.
It seems to me that the income inequality reinforces the political divide because people who have less means are convinced by the right wing and the media that they should vote against their own best economic interests, and they continue to do that.
Yeah.
I think what's very disturbing and worrisome to me is, I really feel like there is a group of people that feel that no matter what it takes, it's acceptable for them to do in order to become the top 1%, the top 1/10%, 1/100th of a percent. That scares the living daylights out of me, that they feel whatever they need to do is acceptable, it's worthy, and the repercussions of that are justified. It's fine.
Thank you.
But even in this very small local region, I'm aware, because of my family, of an enormous gap, of sort of blindness between the really rather comfortably well-off people who stream into Portsmouth and without even thinking about it, spend hundreds of dollars on dinners and going out and stuff like that, and the people who are waiting on them and cooking their meals and selling them stuff in the stores, and they're blind to the difference in what life feels like. They're just, I don't mean this in an individual way, this is a societal problem. People stream into Portsmouth and spend an enormous amount of money, and they're being waited on by people who can't live anywhere nearby, are struggling to pay their bills. Up until Obamacare, maybe many of them certainly didn't have any kind of health insurance, raising their kids without any kind of protection.
People over here heard that? I'm just going to comment on your comment, which I think is one of the things that's happening in, I think, in an extremely unequal society is you sort of have parallel universes. I mean, many of us grew up maybe in communities where there was the concept of the other side of the tracks, but now we're seeing kind of almost different strata. One of the things that gave rise, I think, to the Occupy movement, if you go, I remember going on and reading the stories that people would post. People would write a statement, and say, I am the 99%. And actually, I have a couple of them at the beginning of the book because they're very, very powerful. But the stories were people trapped in poverty, sort of that sense like, I am working for minimum wage, I see no path forward, I'm one injury away from, or paycheck away from destitution, I don't see a way forward, and I'm working, a sense of desperation. There's another strata of people who I would call collapsing middle class, that the experience of the last couple of years was seeing their dreams fundamentally having to change their sense of what was going to be possible. The idea of retiring, taking a vacation, going on a cruise, having something to pass on to your children. All of a sudden people had to readjust, and that's created huge anger and resentment. And some of that's gone sort of Tea Party, and some of that's gone internal, people blaming themselves. Then there's this, this comfortable affluent segment that really is now living in a bubble of affluence and kind of basically saying, everything's fine. Everything's good, everything's fine. And the way the inequality machine works is that wealth creates wealth. We've kind of tipped the rules of the economy to favor asset increasing, wealth growth at the expense of wage increases. And so you have, and if there were no stories in the media about poverty, the conversation about poverty is pretty invisible. And the experience of collapsing middle class, for a couple of years it was a shared experience. Many people were saying, I'm feeling that too, but now that's gone underground and there's sort of this larger sense like everything's fine. But and then younger people, you know, as a couple of you mentioned, people under 30 and what their experience of the economy. The good news, I think, is those are the constituencies for a potentially deep political realignment. Because all the reforms needed to address those concerns, and you've named some of them, are essentially being blocked in the current political system. So the pressure is only going to build for some kind of realignment. And I think that's part of how I look at the possibilities going forward. A couple other people had things they want to say? Yeah.
What's to prevent anybody in this room from becoming 1%? I mean, what stops somebody from wanting more? Is it a bad thing to want more? You know, this whole country is based on free enterprise. And it's based on people being creative and having a desire to make more money so that they can enjoy life.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who want to have a decent life. They don't necessarily need to have huge amassing wealth, but many people aspire to just have a decent, secure life. And then there is some impulse, and this is where I said I grew up in the 1%. There's many, you know, the 1% impulse lives in all of us. You know, sometimes that desire to, like, you know, would we act any different if we had been born into a circumstance or were given certain opportunities or were placed at the head of a company? Maybe we'd like to think we would act differently, but we don't know always. There's sort of ways in which the culture and the systems reinforce a certain way of living.
You gotta have a desire. You gotta have that desire in order to make money, to become successful in life, not just wait for a handout from the government.
Yeah, there's a desire to have control of life too. Yeah. Tom, yeah.
I think that the wealth gap and the sort of recovery that I haven't seen, has made civic engagement much harder.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like you say, over the last 30 years, there's more wage earners in the House working more hours. And, you know, if you're a small business owner, which I am, you likely have fewer employees than you had 7 or 8 years ago because you can't do it anymore. You have to trim that down, which means, you know, if I'm working that many more hours, then I'm not at the city council meeting. And, you know, is that purposeful? Are there people who are riding on that, or is that just a byproduct?
We know how, if you're working 2 jobs, to be able to participate in civic life, let alone religious congregational life, how challenging that can be. Let's just hear maybe 2 from people I haven't heard from. Go ahead. Yeah.
Increasingly, the people who run corporations, these are multinational corporations, they don't really have loyalties to America so much. And, you know, let's say one of them, or middle class is getting hollowed out. They'll say, well, we just created one in China. What would you say to that?
Well, we need to support economic policies that create rooted companies, that create some accountability. You know, so we have a couple thousand global corporations that, you know, operate internationally, use offshore tax systems to shift their costs offshore, not pay any taxes here, force workers in different countries to compete against each other in the race to the bottom for lower wages. So part of it's raising standards and saying, you know, our purchasing policies, how we spend our money, how our communities and towns spend their money, should reinforce corporations that are rooted in localities. We're getting into lots of solution discussion here. I just wonder if there's any other what does this mean for you when you think about your own life? Yeah, just right there.
In some respects, this seems a little trite, and you kind of touched upon it, but to me, an example in our town here in Portsmouth, you look around and you kind of feel the divide getting bigger and bigger. Who the hell can afford to go to dinner in the restaurants in Portsmouth at $100 a pop for 2 people? I walk into our beautiful music hall and say, who the hell can afford to spend $130 for a single ticket to see a concert? That's not me anymore. You know, I feel like paying the $9 for a movie is too much. And it's right here in the middle of our town, and you kind of see this disparity just growing and growing and growing all around us, because I know for myself and many people I know, exactly we're that group that got out of school in the late 70s, early 80s, and adjusted salaries for that period have just sat level the entire time. And someone's making that money, and I own a small company, and I haven't raised my employee's wage in a decade. And you know, the loyalty to stay with a small company is amazing when you think about it, but you just cannot make enough money any longer because it's all going somewhere to the top.
I think thank you for sharing that, because I think one of the ways that you see it here in Portsmouth is look at the housing that's being built along the river. Think about who's able to purchase that house. Think, you know, the median income of a household in Portsmouth. Are they purchasing those houses? And what we see, Mary and I see this in our neighborhood, is a bidding up. She works a lot with first-time home buyers. They've saved up their down payment. They make an offer, and boom, somebody offers cash to purchase a property for $400,000. Who can offer cash? You know, it's because there's people are purchasing in houses or accumulating wealth, and so ordinary working people are out in the marketplace competing, whether it's for a concert ticket or a place to live in a market that's got a lot of speculative activity and is pulling housing costs up and leading to gentrification and displacement. A couple people have things to say, but let me just actually talk about some solution things. Let me offer a framework for a solutions discussion and then open it up again. One thing, your comment I just want to say, the United States, we tend to have a fairly high tolerance for inequality, how wealthy the wealthy are, as long as everybody has an opportunity to have a good life and to become wealthy, and that the rules are fair. But what I think happened, what's interesting, and this is actually, I think, it's interesting, maybe good news, is people are much more alarmed about these inequality trends. Why is it? Because they understand that the opportunities are eroding, that not everyone has the same opportunity. Now there are barriers, and that the rules of the game are rigged. And if you were to say, why is it that inequality has grown so much in 30 years compared to the 30 years before that, we could together come up with a fairly long list: the impact of globalization, tax policy, international trade policies, policies like the TPP, the power of corporations to sort of influence politics, money in politics. We could come up with a pretty good list together. But what I would summarize it as this: there's been a shift in power, meaning that the power of ordinary people has gone down. The power of corporations has gone up. The power of voters has gone down. The power of campaign contributors has gone up. The power of workers has declined. The power of capital and corporations have increased. The power of wage earners has declined. The power of wealth holders have increased. So it's been a power shift. And that the rules governing the economy have been tilted to benefit asset owners at the expense of wage earners. Two Business Week reporters did a book called The Judas Economy: The Triumph of Capital and the Betrayal of Work. That summarized it well. So, first it's important to say these are rules. Rules can be changed one way, and they can also be changed to reflect a different set of values. And the reason why the years after World War II were kind of a golden age of relative equality in the United States was because the rules of the economy were focused on expanding the middle class, expanding the white middle class in particular. We'll talk about that, but the GI Bill for education, a debt-free college education, FHA mortgage insurance, farmers' home, the GI Bill for housing, on and on and on. These were huge investments that enabled a huge percentage of the population to get on the wealth building train and to participate in the economy and grow the middle class. So we made a substantial investment, not just for returning war veterans, but for the whole population. So that gives us some clue as to how to fix this. So there's three types of solutions I would put on the table. One are things that raise the floor. The reason that European countries and Canada do not have the extreme inequalities we have is that they have policies that raise the floor, a minimum wage, a minimal standard through which people cannot fall, health insurance, access to education. There's sort of there's a higher floor. And that makes for a higher quality of life, less stress, I think, on people in some respects. You know that you may lose your job, but you will not become completely destitute, which is the experience people have here. Then there are what I would call the leveling the playing field, things that we can do to make sure that the rules aren't tilted one way or the other. So if you have a small business here in Portsmouth, you have to compete. In the case of Tom, you're competing against a global company like Amazon that creates subsidiaries in other countries to move their tax obligations offshore. We should have one tax code for all the enterprises that have to compete against each other. We should have level playing field rules. Campaign finance reform. Those of you involved in the New Hampshire Rebellion, that's a clear action. We have to sort of break that nexus between money and politics. So there's things to level the playing field. Fair trade policies, so that workers in New Hampshire aren't pitted against workers in Mexico, who are pitted against workers in China for who will work for less and who will work under more degraded environmental conditions. So, but we're not going to actually. Here's the controversial part of my program. We're not going to actually fix these inequalities simply by raising the floor or by leveling the playing field. Because at this point, we have such a concentration of wealth at the top, and that is creating huge distortions in our system. And that's why, so we have to actually, I advocate policies that directly address this concentration of wealth and power, that actually redistribute wealth and power. And let me just mention a couple that I think are important. The reason why, I think one of the primary reasons why we went from the first Gilded Age to the prosperity after World War II was we instituted a federal progressive income tax system and an estate tax income tax system, or wealth tax. And some of you may remember, and that over time meant that some of the highest incomes and largest families with wealth paid back the society that made their wealth possible. I don't know if you remember a couple years ago, 2001, President George W. Bush came into office. He had campaigned on get rid of the death tax, and which was to get rid of the estate tax. And I had organized an effort to try to get people to defend the estate tax. And I got a bunch of business people who owned substantial businesses to say, look, we should keep the estate tax. And right after President Bush was elected, it was clear that was going to be his #1 legislative priority, get rid of the estate tax, which at that time was a tax on wealth, families with wealth over $3 million. And I got a call from Bill Gates. Somebody said Bill Gates is on the phone for you. Right. And I work with a lot of jokers, and this would not be not unusual to have somebody play that kind of prank on me. But it was Bill Gates Sr., the father of the founder of Microsoft. And he said, I heard you're organizing to keep the estate tax. I think the estate tax is a fundamentally American tax. I think it's a healthy thing for wealthy families to pay back a portion of their wealth to society. It's an economic opportunity recycling program. I was like, wow, great concept. Meaning if you've been so fortunate to have grown wealth, at the end of your life you pay back a portion of it so other young people who are not wealthy have the same opportunity. And we went out, he said, how can I help? And I was like, okay, the father of the wealthiest man on the planet at the time wants to offer his help. And I said, well, we can write articles and op-eds, we can go meet members of Congress, we could start a petition and go out and get prominent Americans to defend the estate tax. And he said, I'll do all those things. I'll sign me up. You know, helping the kid run his foundation, but this is my #1 cause. And true to form, he went to Washington on a number of occasions. He and I wrote a book about the estate tax, and we launched this petition. And I said, well, I'll go talk to, you know, Nancy Brown in Portsmouth, and I'll go talk to my friend Mark Rothenberg, who has a software company, and I'll get these people to sign this. And he said, well, I'll go talk to Warren Buffett and Paul Newman and Agnes Gunn at the Metropolitan Museum. And he said, okay, you work your network. And we got, you know, front page New York Times story, you know, 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to step up and say, tax us. You know, what makes America great is we had this opportunity to grow this wealth, and now we should be taxed and we should pay back to society. And we stopped the repeal of the estate tax. I mean, it went through a rough patch, but we stopped it. And today there's an estate tax on wealth, household wealth over $10 million. And it's a rate of 40%, so if you have $11 million, you start to pay an estate tax on that first million over $10 million. But what we discovered at the end of last year was the revenues of the estate tax have dramatically gone down. And what we've learned is that some of the wealthiest families in the country have figured out a way to use trusts and sort of planning techniques to dodge the estate tax. And so we learned in December that Sheldon Adelson, the casino mogul, just moved $8 billion to his children through trusts that will, for the next century, be beyond the reach of any taxation. And that by doing that, he just dodged $2.8 billion in estate taxes. And so now we've learned there's this huge, what I call the billionaire loophole. So one of the things we have to do is come back and lobby to close the billionaire loophole. It should be, it's not impossible to do this, but it's actually, from a Thomas Piketty point of view, his argument is we should have wealth taxation. Well, we have a form of wealth taxation, and we actually need to defend it and then make it a little more progressive. At one point, there were progressive rates in the estate tax, so that a fortune over 50 million would pay more than a fortune of 10 million, and a fortune of $1 billion would pay more, and you could have a graduated rate structure. And that's what we want, and that's what our coalition is working on. So addressing is absolutely essential. And it's a tough conversation to have, and you all live in New Hampshire, I don't have to tell you that. It's even tougher here to talk taxes with your neighbors. But a number of you immediately went to that, and I think it's actually a linchpin. Thomas Piketty says that a progressive tax system is kind of the foundation of a healthy civilized society. And if taxation becomes voluntary for the wealthy, as you pointed out, we're in really, really big trouble. A couple other quick proposals. Financial transaction tax. Now, if we actually think, oh my gosh, we have so little money, there's austerity, there's budget deficits, let me find you $1 trillion real fast. A financial transaction tax, which is now being instituted in European countries, a 1 cent on every $4 of financial transactions would raise $250 to $300 billion a year, mostly on high-frequency traders. This is why Michael Lewis has a new book out called Flash Boys, which is about the sort of sector of Wall Street that's just churning and skimming wealth. And a financial transaction tax would put a little speed bump on that and would raise a substantial amount of money. A progressive estate tax. Taxing income from capital gains the same as income from work. Right now we tax work higher than we tax capital gains. That's the Warren Buffett proposal, right? Warren Buffett says, how is it that my secretary pays a lower tax rate than I do?
Higher.
Because my income is higher. The other way around, right? How come my secretary pays a higher tax rate? How come she's paying 31% and I'm paying 15%? And, you know, above a certain level, above $1 million, all income, whether it's sourced, should be taxed at the income tax, high income tax rate. So those are just a couple of tax interventions. The other big one, and there's actually an opportunity to fix this, and I put a little sheet together. I put it over here, but I'll pass it out to anybody who didn't get it, called Addressing America's Income and Wealth Gap, that has a bunch of these actions here. I'll just pass that. There's more here. Today, there's what people call an offshore tax system. If you're Pfizer drug company, you have created a subsidiary in another country, and that you kind of play this shell game and game your taxes down to nothing. United Parcel Service pays like a 28% federal income tax effectively, and FedEx pays 0. You think that they're kind of in the same business space, but FedEx has all these subsidiaries offshore. So we can close this offshore tax system. Congressman Sander Levin, a number of other senators have done hearings on this. The United States could take the lead in closing some of these secrecy jurisdictions, and it would raise anywhere from $100 to $200 billion a year. So those are really powerful interventions. Your U.S. senators and representatives should be co-sponsors of those. And I list Americans for Tax Fairness as another resource group. Maybe I will just stop there. I mean, there's a couple of other things here, that these are things that people know about. Things like raising the minimum wage, reforming Wall Street, getting money out of politics. Whatever you're doing on July 4th or 5th, if you're in the state of New Hampshire, you have this tremendous opportunity to influence the national political discussion by being part of the New Hampshire Rebellion. And then I think there's the work to reverse Citizens United and that the ways in which corporations have gotten so much power and wealth. And on the back I put a little more information just about the Tomas Piketty links and information on that. Let me stop there and hear, let me just close with one other story though. People sort of say, is this possible to reverse, right? You know, oh my God, this is like a... And what I see is a real kind of awakening of people on these issues. There's young people, campus organizations, these inequality issues are kind of hitting on the radar screen in the way that they have it. And just to give one example, a couple months ago I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in a march for this financial transaction tax that I just mentioned to you. And how many of you have ever been in a large march with hundreds of people in support of a really good tax idea? Yeah, that's what I thought. In this case, there were 6,000 people marching for a financial transaction tax. Now, I happen to know that 5,500 of them were nurses because they were all wearing red shirts. And the National Nurses Union has basically said that they've made this financial transaction tax kind of a cornerstone of their program. So I'm in this march and I'm walking along and I'm surrounded by a sea of nurses wearing their red shirts. And on the front of the shirt it says, you know, if you save a life, you're a hero. If you save 100 lives, you're a nurse. Any nurses in the... Okay, all right. So I'm walking along, and there's this woman next to me marching, and I said, so what's your name? She says, my name is Eleanor. I said, well, where are you from, Eleanor? She says, I'm from Taunton, Massachusetts. Taunton? I'm from Boston. I got people in Taunton, so we're talking. Where do you work at Taunton City Hospital? I said, so I'm curious, why are you here? She says, oh, well, you know, I got off my shift last night and I got on the bus with all my brothers and sisters from the hospital and we all came down, we stayed up all night. We arrived here at like 7 in the morning and we marched, and now we're going to meet with our members of Congress to lobby on the financial transaction tax. And you know, then we have an free hour to go to the Smithsonian Museum, and then we're going to take the bus back to Taunton. like, wow. And and then I have to go back to work. I said, wow, I hope you're not my emergency room nurse. But she said, I said, well, I get that, but why are you here? And just to give you a picture, Eleanor is holding a sign that says, Heal America, Tax Wall Street. And this financial transaction tax, they call it the Wall Street tax. And she says, oh, I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm an emergency room nurse. For the last 4 years, I have watched the economic crisis come into my emergency room on the bodies of my patients. I have seen people who have come in because of the stress conditions that they felt in this economy. I've seen people come in because they've hurt somebody, they've hurt themselves, or they've hurt somebody they love. She says, the clincher for me was I was doing an intake on a man who had just come in. He was presenting heart attack symptoms. He's lying on a gurney. And I say, so what's your name? Mr. Thomas. I say, what's your address, Mr. Thomas? And he says, I just lost my house. That's why I'm having this chest pain. And Eleanor says, you know, when you see enough of that, you see the impact of greed and on people, you just want to do something about it. So, you know, I'm not a very political person, and I've never ever been to Washington, D.C. in my whole life, but I just said, I got to get on the bus and be part of this. You know, that's the reason why I think there's a possibility. Eleanor got on the bus. She got on the bus with 100 other nurses from Taunton. They spent their weekend in Washington, 2 hours. They got to go to the Smithsonian. And she turned to me and she said, do you know about the financial transaction tax? About a month ago, there were like 20 people who knew about it. And now you're giving me the rap about it, you know? That's good. So there are lots of Eleanors out there. They're waking up, they're seeing this, and they're basically saying, you know what, I'm not going to stand by and allow this to happen to my sisters and brothers. So, anyway, thank you for listening. And yeah, questions, comments here? Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think is pretty concerning, and those are going to be monumental fights for us to be able to achieve, and I agree with all of them. But there are little things that we can do every day to decrease that separation, that divide that has been happening. And it's very concerning to me what I'm seeing happening in our state and on our country, these themes that are emerging, anti-government, public versus private, public sector versus private sector workers, the concept of efficiency always being tied to saving money. I lost mine, you should lose yours. I mean, just this pitting against each other, divide and conquer strategy, and taking from one another. And also legal theft. I mean, the courts are stacked against us. You know, today I was at the New Hampshire Supreme Court listening to the oral argument about whether or not it was legal for the New Hampshire legislature to take $75 million away from public employees. The United States Supreme Court is currently, we're awaiting a decision that could wreck unions in this country, right? And there's another Supreme Court case that's pending that, you know, I mean, it's just in every different way, it's getting to us, and it's very concerning. And I would just ask us all to try to not let that happen to us psychologically and emotionally.
Amen.
Thank you. I would say, you know, you just, you know, the altar call or whatever we call it, you know, I mean, I think there are things that we can do in our daily lives to resist some of these forces. And it could be in our interpersonal relationships. I mean, I think some of you talked about the invisibility of people working in certain jobs in our community. You know, one of the great things about Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dime, was sort of lifting up and making visible the invisible workers that, you know, around us. And then public servants. Actually, there's an exhibit in the library over here, I just was walking around before, called "Did You See a Public Worker Today?" And it shows like a police officer and somebody fixing the street and stuff like that, the sort of invisible workers. So I think there's ways in which we can interrupt certain attitudes and statements and kind of redirect or engage with people on some of those points that you made. And I think one of the most poisonous narratives coming out of the last couple of years is this concept of takers. You know, like, Mitt Romney, his campaign, the videotape that was made saying, that 47% of the population are takers. They take, they don't give. They're parasites. And it's that kind of Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged view of the world, which is that there's the prime movers. There are those people who are like over here driving the engine, pushing the economy forward, the geese that lay the golden egg, and we should just worship them and exalt them. And then there's the parasites and the takers. And to just think about 47%, I mean, we're talking about people who are retired, or people who are on disability, or people who are children, or people at different stages of our lives. We are more interdependent and dependent on one another, and it's the opposite of the "we're in it together," divided we fall, and we are falling, because we're so fragmented and divided that we're allowing this to happen around us. So thank you for. Yes, sir.
I go to all these things. I'm an activist. I've been an activist for a long time, and always the solutions are more democracy. And it strikes me, you're probably familiar with the recent paper that was done, I think, with Martin Gillens at Princeton University about where he looked at the policy choices that were made over a course of 20 years, and he was wanting to put America on a spectrum of between democracy and oligarchy, and he discovered that virtually never is the average American given his preference or his or her preference in the policy choices that are made by the government. And it seems to me that always we think we still live in a democracy, and we don't live in a democracy. I mean, there's a real difference in the political environment between the Gilded Age, the decentralized, when the economy was much more decentralized and politics was much more decentralized than it is now. Now, with the concentration of wealth, we have this concentration of power. It's a different political environment. We don't live in a democracy. And I'm wondering, as somebody who's still organizing, what do we do about this? I mean, it seems to me that, just one more point, that people, I was trying to organize a local community meeting recently that, virtually nobody showed up for, despite the fact that the word went out. But people say, well, it doesn't do any good. And according to the paper by the Princeton guy, well, they're absolutely right. It's a rational choice to not be involved civically. And how do you get past it? How do you get past the rational choice that the average citizen who's not an activist makes about that? That's what's frustrating to me about all of these subjects.
Yeah. The one thing, I actually think that if we go back 100 years ago in 1914, I think things looked comparably bleak, if you will. Meaning that it seemed like we were living in an oligarchy society. The great trusts, the big corporations ruled. There was incredible corruption of the political system. Senators were completely bought and were patrons of the wealthy. We didn't have direct election of senators. And somehow I think that the emerging labor movement, the populist movement that kind of worked for decades to get income tax and federal progressive wealth taxes instituted, direct election of U.S. senators, even in the bleakest time, people were sort of pushing for reforms, maintaining independent media. Face-to-face forums like this were absolutely important. And then there are trigger events. And I think part of what I would invite us to think about is we are in a kind of a movement realignment preparation stage. We are going through, we are creating networks, we are having discussions, we are engaging leaders, we are practicing and preparing because there will be trigger events. There'll be another economic bump in the road. There'll be ecological challenges. There will be grotesque examples of corruption that will require response. And that is when all that groundwork that you have been laying will come to fruition, I believe. You are preparing that I remember, I was actually, not to get off topic, but I was a 17, 18-year-old opponent of the Seabrook power plant. And I remember standing outside the movie theater in Worcester, Massachusetts, with my leaflet about the movie The China Syndrome was showing, you know, and we had this little leaflet saying, you know, if you care about nuclear power, you should blah, 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 blah. And, you know, 7 people came to our meetings, and, you know, we were leafleting, and then somebody came out of the movie theater, they said, did you hear about that? There was an accident in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island. And we're like, really? And we went out and changed our leaflet, you know. This happened. And the next meeting, our 7-person meeting, had 120 people. And we formed committees, and we, you know, and lo and behold, no new nuclear power plants were licensed after those initial plants were completed. I mean, it was a fundamental shift. All that preparation work that sometimes seemed, you know, we wondered if it mattered, I think will matter. And I think that, you know, frankly, all the reforms of Dodd-Frank and after Wall Street did not fundamentally get at the underlying machinery that's creating these problems. We didn't change the risky behavior of banks. We've now, the shadow banking system has reopened, the hedge funds are active, the betting windows have opened up again, the speculation in real estate, the speculation in shale gas and natural gas and fracking is now frothing up the system. All kinds of investment bets are being placed on this idea of a century of cheap energy, which is not going to happen. All of that is going to mean that we're going to be right back at 2008 again, maybe even up a creek further. That is going to be the moment, our moment of reckoning. And that is when all the discussions, the analysis, the proposals, the meetings, the networks that we formed will be absolutely essential. So I invite us to think about we're preparing ourselves, and we're preparing our neighbors, and we're preparing other leaders to be part of a realignment that could substantially shift the direction of the country, because the underlying conditions that we're talking about are not going away. They're only good, the pressure's only going to continue to build. We have to explain and interpret what's going on and engage people, but people will be paying attention. There will be another 2008 moment when people will be paying attention, and that will be the moment where I think we can make some huge shifts in the places we're talking about. I thought Tom had his question up and then.
Yeah, my question was going to be, and then I realized this other parallel to the Gilded Age, because it happened then too in terms of demographics being a huge factor. I think one of the things that changed in the early 20th century was the huge influx of immigrants after they'd been here for a while started to, they weren't just taking any job that they could get, they started to be active. And, you know, one of the things you haven't talked about this 10% of this 1/10 of the 1% is what their demographic makeup is. And, you know, they can hang on for a really long time through shenanigans and what have you, but at a certain point, isn't demographics just going to win? Hopefully.
Meaning that there would be a realignment of, you mean, new immigrant voters and?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're increasing our population, and we're not increasing it with the top 1/10 of 1%. We're increasing it with lower, and we're either going to have a feudal system that is locked in, or we're going to have some sort of realignment.
It'll be a sort of how much can you tolerate kind of situation? How much plutocracy can we live with until we push back? I mean, one actually hopeful thing is the 1% is not monolithic. There are the segments of the 1% that I call the kind of, they're the rule riggers. They use their wealth and power to use the political system to accumulate more wealth and power. I mean, the Koch brothers is a classic example of that, right? They are hyper-engaged using their substantial oil wealth to block sane climate policy, to, you know, elect or unelect different people. They're engaged. But there's a huge percentage, that's a small segment of the 1% that are really, really hyper-engaged. The vast majority are kind of probably passive. But there's a segment that is on a countervailing segment that understand how these extreme inequalities are undermining the quality of life for themselves and everyone else, and need to be engaged also in the substantial way. So, you know, that's part of our organizing strategy, is to win over the allies or get them engaged. And we have this project called Wealth for the Common Good and the Patriotic Millionaires. If you Google them and look at them. But that's, you know, it's not a substitute for grassroots organizing, but it's a complement when you have, you know, 100 CEOs and multimillionaires and billionaires say, you know, raise taxes on the top, or 1,200, 1,500 as we had around the estate tax. So that's part of the strategy and they also help change the conversation, you know, about wealth and deservedness by just simply telling the truth, which is, you know, I have very good fortune to have this wealth. You know, yes, I worked hard. My company, you know, had these opportunities, but there's something very remarkable about the United States and the things we do together that make it possible for businesses to flourish, and I have an obligation to pay back to society. They're very, very good messengers.
When I look at this list of that you have here on your handout, it seems to me you can't get really to any of those items if you don't get the money out of politics. So I'm wondering, should the energy and the effort really go to campaign finance reform and things like that? Because until you change how Washington operates and get the money out of politics, virtually every other item you have on this list can change.
You know, I think I partly agree with you, but I actually think we're sort of like in this situation where there's a bunch of rocks and they're sort of stuck together, and you're trying to push one forward. For instance, we've had campaign finance reform. As long as there's this incredible concentration of wealth, it's like money is running down a hill, and the money will kind of rush around any barriers that are put up. So, you know, I lived through several generations of various campaign finance reforms that haven't actually succeeded because the concentration of wealth will always undermine them. And so that's why I think pushing forward on the campaign finance reform, but also, you know, using the fact that 80% of the population think, you know, that we should raise taxes on the top. You know, 71% with like 30% of Republicans included in that. We should raise, you know, taxes on wealth and taxes on a high income, and sort of push forward these incremental reforms that begin to chip away at the concentration of wealth itself. So I agree. If you're here in New Hampshire and, you know, lean into this New Hampshire rebellion, because you can have a national impact in this state. And, you know, I think it has to move in tandem with some of these other reforms, Wall Street reforms, and tax policies. Yeah.
I wanted to share a positive story that just happened last night relative to this whole issue of civic engagement. I videotaped the Sanbornton town meeting last night, and they did pass. They were the 51st town to pass an effort to get a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. But one really interesting thing that happened was a woman had documented the decline in civic engagement when they separated their town meeting and brought it into May and left the town the elections of public officials and so forth, school department events in March. They went from like 600 people voting down to 43 voting on multi-million-dollar budgets. And last night they decided to go back to joint meetings so that when people were engaged, they went to both the school voting and the town. So that was a very positive story last night.
Are those 51 towns all in New Hampshire?
They are.
Yeah. So this move to amend effort, you know, if you think about the national political avenue as blocked, so what is it we can do at the state and local level? Move to amend is a great example of moving where you have where democracy is still functioning to make things happen, and putting resolutions together and getting communities to vote, and that engages and affects your elected officials and the like. So I think similarly, the move your money movement, you know, people moving their money out of the large banks, moving them into local banks, moving money out of the fossil fuel sector into the sort of safe new energy economy. You know, nobody's stopping anybody from taking those actions. You can take those actions. So we have to act where we have space to move as much as we can. Yeah.
I work in an unemployment office, so I hope I don't see anybody sitting at my desk. Some of your solutions here I've heard over and over again, but I think what's missing is that the best anti-poverty program is a job. And working with claimants and business people, it's what I do all day, is on the phone and talking to people. I wonder how some of these people who've been unemployed for about 20 weeks are surviving, quite frankly. And once they run out of benefits, I'd like an investigation on that. How are these people surviving after their 26 weeks is up? But the best anti-poverty program is a job. And I doubt that the person who served me tonight at this Thai place tonight is going to be able to, regardless of what my tip is going to be able to afford one of these condos in Portsmouth. And there's another, and so we need to get back to some sort of an industrial policy where we actually hire people that are not dependent on minimum wage tips. Now, some of the environmentalists out there are going to say, oh, no industry. Well, it was industry that produced the middle class, where you could work at a factory or a small factory or a machine shop or something. And if you worked overtime, you did better. You worked hard and played by the rules, you got somewhere. And we've lost that. We just don't want industry anymore for some reason. And that's the only way to get out of poverty. You don't tax yourself necessarily into prosperity. If you want to make work worth something, you've got to have a decent job so people can afford some of the housing downtown. Another point you made about the ecology in all of this, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, is because you take a drive 10 minutes down here to all the sands and all the houses that are on the coast. Those are 1%ers who live there. And with rising sea levels, okay, that ocean out there is always going to win. It's the way it is. They're going to win. Yeah. And you wait and see, because this is happening on Plum Island after Hurricane Sandy, is that when the sea levels rise and there's a big storm demolishing Judd Gregg's house and everybody else's that are down there, guess who's going to want to be bailed out by the taxpayer to replace their homes? They're going to want to be bailed out for the accesses they have on their shoreline, with less and less and less beach access to the public. That's ecological and economy coming together, as you said, because all the shoreline property, that's going to go away with sea level rise. But when a disaster happens there, because this happened at Plum Island, the taxpayer, shouldn't the taxpayer be involved on bailing these houses out that shouldn't have been built there in the first place?
That's right.
Why not? We bail out banks.
We should push back against that, that insurance program. I think we shouldn't have to subsidize rebuilding in places where houses shouldn't be built. On your first point, I think there's a planning for ecological change could be part of that industrial policy that you mentioned, or part of the planning ahead. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. There's work to be done in our communities. There's work in schools, reducing the ratio of students to teachers. There's work to deal with ecological repair and remediation and adaptation and preparation for climate change. These can be retrofitting buildings, retrofitting every leaky triple house in New England. There's ways we can redirect capital away from sort of the old economy to making the kind of investments that will create living wage jobs as well. So I think planning, some form of economic planning is absolutely right, including government as employer of last resort. So the Works Project Administration was a job with dignity. People want to work, people want to be able to contribute, and to be able to when you're absolutely right, think of the people after a year, the impact that has, whereas there's work to be done. So how do we match the work that needs to be done with the resources that are there? And then we just need to dramatically redirect.
Can I share a good news?
So there's a couple people who have had their hands up but haven't said anything. But I want to hear your...
Just a good news story that fast food workers are striking in more than 150 cities in actions. There are actual actions in 80 cities in 33 countries, crossing 6 continents all today, one singular day. Manila, Brazil, El Salvador, the Netherlands, and so many more countries.
150 communities had demonstrations at fast food restaurants calling for raising the fast food minimum wage to $15. And that
33 countries.
That was a global.
I just want to point out tax policies. And, mentioned the first Gilded Age was like the 1890s. The tariff structure of the country is very prominent, and that fostered those production of the Gilded Age, the industries, the Gilded Age. And after that was demolished with the crisis of 1907, and then it was all busted up, but we had income tax, and tariffs finally were removed by Reagan, I guess, in the 70s or 80s. But less important part of our economy. And then we went to a free trade type organization, and that fostered sort of a deindustrialization of this country, and a strong dollar policy where it made sense for industry to go offshore, and we lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, which is value-added product that creates wealth. If we don't have that, we can't make money. So, and the other thing for jobs is we had a seed program in the 70s for the bad times there. A lot of people got their start in the economy with the hand from the government with the seed jobs. We don't have that.
This other gentleman made a point, I think, about corporations that have no national loyalty. And if you think most businesses are anchored, place-based, they're, some of the business owners here in this room are examples of locally based business. But there's and Jim Collins, a journalist, has a book called Built to Last. Businesses that are in it for the long term, healthy, rooted businesses that give back to the community, they build goodwill. But there's a segment of international, global, cross-state businesses I would characterize as built to loot, or built to shift their costs. Their business model is short-term extraction and shifting costs off of their balance sheet onto the society. So, okay, I'm not going to give my employees health insurance. Society's going to have to take care of them. And I'm not going to pay taxes because I've got to use my offshore system to shift my tax obligations off me. Someone else is going to have to pay for the roads and the infrastructure that my businesses use. And I'm going to pay low wages so that the society will have to provide health and other food stamps for these workers. So it's a way. It's a shifting on. I'm going to take my environmental costs and externalize them, so the society will have to clean up the messes. So it's that kind of pathological short-term extraction of gain. And the only response that we have to that is to protect ourselves and our communities by walling off and protecting and raising standards. So you want to do business here? We have certain wage standards, and we have employment job protections rights, and we have unionization to protect workers against this, and we require corporations that do business in this community to pay their fair share of taxes. And we can constrain that build-to-loot model and lift up the businesses that are built to last and have a commitment to place. And we can do that with our spending power.
Beautiful.
You know, and Tom was saying, you know, well, when he thinks about inequality, he thinks about Amazon. You know, and here's a global company that dodges taxes, that has taken advantage of every regulatory space they can to destroy local independent bookstores and more than that. Right? It's destroying main streets. I mean, we have a vibrant Main Street in Portsmouth, but there's sort of specialty shops, and more people are buying things through this portal. Finally, they're going to have to pay sales tax. But anyway, so we do have some agency in terms of, do we want to support built-to-last businesses that are rooted in our communities, or are we going to put our money into the built-to-loot enterprises? So we can all decide, we can all vote with our consumer dollars to some extent on things like that.
I know we have to close down pretty soon, but I'm assuming some of you have heard that there's a discussion, at least the beginning of a discussion about getting a group together to talk about affordable housing. And that was mentioned several times tonight, that we have all these workers here that are feeding the folks that are coming in as tourists, whatever. And now there's these luxury condos that are going to be built, and what we really need is affordable housing. So if you're interested in at least thinking about continuing some of these discussions or getting involved in the community, there's all kinds of opportunities here to do that. Jim Splain, who's assistant mayor, right? He has offered to host some meetings at people's houses, or maybe come to the library and talk about what we could do to get affordable housing going in this community for all these workers. Anyway, just keep your eyes and ears open and we can continue this. Obviously, there's a lot of work.
You know, one of my early jobs in the 80s was I worked with the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, helped start up, and I would go around and work with mobile home parks. My first mobile home park resident buyout was in Meredith, New Hampshire. 8 mobile home residents bought their park as a cooperative, still own it. There's now, I think, 65 of these mobile home cooperatives. In Concord, we started the Concord Area Trust for Community Housing, CATCH, which now has hundreds of units of permanently affordable housing. I'm sure that some of this work is happening here, but there's some great models in New Hampshire that have the support of the state and sort of the nonprofit sector that can create rooted, permanently affordable housing for long-term residents. And so people don't have to compete in the private market, which is costs are being bid up. There's a percentage of the housing stock that's protected from those speculative forces. And I think that's the ultimate answer. And it's a very beautiful community-based response. So I encourage you to get together and also maybe visit or have the folks from Concord to come and talk about what they're doing, or Cheshire Housing Trust, some of those groups around the state.
So can we